Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 42. The Rule of the Major Generals. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new members of the Patreon House of Lords, Earl Ken and Earl Robert. If you'd like to join their ranks and not only listen to the podcast ad-free, but help support the show, then go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, past, present, and future. Last time, we talked about Oliver Cromwell's spymaster, John Thurlow, and how he defended the Lord Protector from plots against his life and his government. We also saw how the news of the Western design, how God had seemingly withdrawn his favour from the Protectorate at Hispaniola, devastated the government and Cromwell personally. He withdrew into prayer, fasting, and discussions with his advisers, and he came to the conclusion that if God had revoked his support, it had to be because he was displeased. In order to restore God's favour, Cromwell and his council decided on a course of action which was, by far, the most unpopular policy of the Protectorate period: the rule of the Major Generals. The origins of this policy came from the ashes of Penruddock's uprising, so never say it didn't achieve anything. Major General Desborough had been sent by the government to put this rebellion down, but as we saw last time, by the time he actually got to Dorset, the rebels had already been defeated. But Desborough didn't just wash his hands of things and turn around back to London. Though many of the 400 rebels had been captured, some had escaped, and these fugitives had to be tracked down. To aid in this, Cromwell had given Desborough authority over the local structures, the justices of the peace, local sheriffs, bailiffs and mayors, and the newly appointed commissioners in Dorset, to identify royalists throughout the region. He soon had a list of more than 5,000 royalists, identified through these local networks, some of whom had been actively working against the government, but many who had not. By the end of May, news of his successes had reached London. Desborough's brother-in-law, Lord Protector Cromwell, promoted him to, quote, Major General of all the militia forces raised and to be raised within the counties of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Dorset, Wiltshire, and Gloucester. Desborough was the first of the major generals, but similar projects were right then being established around Lincoln and East Anglia. Over the summer of 1655, a committee consisting of Desborough, John Lambert, Sir Gilbert Pickering, and Cromwell himself met and drew up a draft for a new system of military governors. Lambert put his constitutional talents to good use in these discussions. Besides the army, the Protectorate's other base of popular support were the godly, and he worked to bring these two bases closer together. By the end of August, the first drafts had been decided on, and though it would be revised before it was published, the basic structure was now set. There would be 12 new military governorships, with their primary responsibility being the suppression of insurrection. They would do this through collaboration between these new major generals of the army and local authorities, with the major generals being backed by a new force of mounted militia, as well as appointed commissioners. There would be 62 troops of cavalry and 2 infantry companies, numbering 6,250 men. They were involved in the surveillance and disarming of known royalists and Catholics, and the policing of anywhere that conspirators might gather, whether that was in private residences or at public events, like cockfights, bear baiting, and horse races. The militia would also have the power to arrest vagrants, putting them to work or expelling them from the region or from the country entirely, leading to their transportation. There had been a rebellion, and now there'd be a crackdown. So far, so mundane, even if this system of military governors was more involved than anything England had seen outside of wartime. But remember last time, when that ship carrying the info hazard of defeat had arrived in July? When Cromwell and his council emerged from their prayers, They did so with a new zeal. Penruddock's uprising had been a shot across the bow from God, a warning, even if Providence had meant it was nipped in the bud. The defeat at Hispaniola was a far more serious blow to the Protector's spirits. In drawing up this new system, Cromwell and those around him viewed any approach which only treated the earthly symptoms of disorder as doomed to fail. No, what the Protectorate needed was a moral reformation. Only when England, and this system was confined to England and Wales, was morally redeemed and socially reformed, would Providence return to them. Only then would the realm be safe from enemies both foreign and domestic. The drafts of this new plan sat for a month before Cromwell could properly address them. The Protector had never been in the strongest health. How many times have I mentioned that Cromwell was sick? But the bad news of the Western design appears to have caused a summer of poor health. On the 21st of September, he was well enough to properly attend the committee and discuss the two proposals. One was a commission for the Major Generals, and the other were the orders for both these new governors and the county commissions which were to be established. There were to be 19 Major Generals appointed to the 12 governorships, chosen from amongst those closest to Cromwell, both personally and ideologically. I won't throw out all their names, but I will pick out a few key figures. John Lambert was, of course, one of them. He was put in charge of the North and given 2 deputies so that he could balance his new responsibilities and his existing duty to the Council of State. Robert Lilburne would oversee Yorkshire and Durham. Philip Skippon would remain in charge of London and the surrounding counties. James Berry held Wales and the Marches, while Desborough, the model of all subsequent Major Generals, remained in the West. These were men who, by and large, were aligned with Cromwell's world views. Politically, they were supportive of the instrument of government and the Protectorate. But religiously, they were more of a mixed bag. They were all Puritans of one flavour or another, but some were more moderate than others. On one side, you'd have someone like Edward Whaley, who was more moderate, whereas Charles Wolseley, the Major General for the North West, would work himself into an early grave. He was so zealous in his pursuit of sin. Below these Major Generals were the Commissioners, military and civilian men numbering between 10 and more than 30, depending on the size of a Major General's jurisdiction. Ian Gentles puts the total figure of commissioners at around 1,000, many of whom were soldiers, but also they included minor landowners and middling merchants. These were agents of the Major Generals, acting as their eyes and ears. The vast majority of the Major Generals and their commissioners were, in the views of many of the country notables they now lorded over, as well as royalist pamphleteers, up-jumped oiks. Traditional elites who expected and received deference and authority in positions such as Justices of the Peace were horrified at this overturning of the natural order of things. A Major General's success at managing and working with these elites often decided how effective they were in their roles. But what exactly was their role? What were the Major Generals meant to be doing, other than handling security? That second set of instructions divided known royalists into 3 groups. The first group were those known to have been involved in Penruddock's Rising and its affiliated plots. They were to be imprisoned or banished and their estates sequestered. Okay, fair enough. They'd been involved in rebellion and lost. The second group were those who, quote, by their words and actions adhere to the interest of the late king or of Charles Stuart, his son, end quote. They might also be exiled or imprisoned, depending on how they acted, but their property was left secure. All right, this is getting a bit dicey, but not too objectionable if they supported the effective overthrow of a government for that government to respond, at least by 17th century standards. The third grouping was the most controversial, because it overruled the Act of Oblivion. To refresh your memory, in 1652, the Rump Parliament had passed the Act of Oblivion, which stated that all former royalists who agreed to live peacefully under the new republic would be pardoned for any actions they'd taken prior to the Battle of Worcester. There were lots of conditions and exceptions made in the second reading, and Cromwell and the army weren't thrilled at how many former enemies who had surrendered to them wouldn't be included in the pardon. But the army's honour aside, at least it would begin the healing of the nation after the wars. Well, now in October 1655, it was declared that any royalist who had fought against Parliament since 1642 was now liable for a special tax. Regardless of if they'd never picked up a weapon since Edge Hill, or had been quietly living their lives since the regicide, they now faced the decimation tax. 10% of their property over a certain amount was to be paid annually. This money was specifically ring-fenced in order to pay for the rule of the Major Generals. A declaration was issued on the 31st of October, which laid out the government's justification for these new measures. The previous Act of Oblivion had been conditional on royalist good behaviour. Acting against the government, then the Rump, now the Protectorate, voided those pardons. But Penruddock's uprising and other plots, including attempted assassinations of Cromwell, had shown that this leniency was a mistake. Quote, "The insurrection evidently involved the whole party, by implications." End quote. Essentially, where before the royalists had been judged as individuals, now they were judged as a group, and they were judged guilty. This was collective punishment. Since the royalists, as a collective, had by their actions required the new system of military rule, the royalists, as a collective, should pay for it. In addition, bonds for good behaviour were to be paid by some 14,000 known royalists who risked an additional fine of £5,000 if found wanting. More paranoid measures were put in place. Any royalist visiting London had to make themselves known to the government at a registry office within 24 hours. Soon, anyone entering the country had to present themselves to the Major General of their port of entry, or his representatives, and explain who they were and why they were here. If they didn't, they'd be imprisoned or deported. At the same time, the newly appointed Major Generals went out to their jurisdictions and began their important work. They were on a deadline. The decimation tax had to be collected by the 21st of December every year. No problem in January 1656, but a bit of a tight turnaround in November 1655. As with many things, the experience of someone subject to the decimation tax varied from place to place, depending on who their Major General was and who their commissioners were. Some were outright vindictive. Commissioners usually came from their locality and brought with them whatever personal histories they'd had. Grudges could now be settled, personal enemies squeezed for every penny, safe in the knowledge that the state and its army was behind you. But this wasn't the only experience. The justification presented in Cromwell's declaration didn't come from nowhere. There were commissioners and major generals who did see royalists as a whole as guilty, and by taxing them, the innocent were kept undisturbed, and so they carried out their duties fairly, as they saw it. There were also commissioners who felt socially inferior when dealing with those above them. The powerful Seymour family of Jane fame, and who are still Dukes of Somerset, were dealt with very lightly. In Stafford, a commissioner wrote to inform his more elevated friend that, unfortunately, he would have to be taxed, but don't worry about coming to me, I'll come to you, the weather's terrible. That said, many commissioners were the hotter sort of Protestant. They were the elect, they were doing God's work, and so it didn't matter how blue someone's blood was. They were going to pay up. Except not if they appealed to London. On many occasions, major generals were appalled at the leniency which Cromwell and the Council of State showed. Major General Whaley wrote to Thurlow at one such occasion, complaining that the government was being too nice and embracing royalists, quote, into your bosoms, especially eminent ones, before the Lord hath wrought real change and work of grace in their hearts." End quote. All of this work led to a lot of paperwork, as you can imagine, and from the records which survive, accounting for a third of the counties in England and Wales, perhaps 2,000 royalists were decimated, raising about £50,000. Considering £80,000 was needed to pay for the new militarisation, this was not a moneymaker. Partly this was due to limitations. There were simply too many royalists for the commissioners to deal with. At best, 30 individuals could be investigated in a week, and that was on a good week, and only in certain regions. Wales, for example, had very few royalists of means compared to somewhere like the northwest of England, which had many old Catholic aristocratic families, who Wolsey rinsed for every penny he could get. Considering the shortage of manpower, the best defence against decimation was simply not getting to the top of the list. The windfall from the decimation tax was tiny compared to the resentment it created. Not only were royalists against it, even if they didn't meet the £100 threshold, many more saw this as an illegal and unparliamentary tax, ship money born again. Within months, the costs of this new system of surveillance couldn't be ignored. Cuts were made. The numbers of militia troops under the command of each major general were reduced to save money, and it was further reformed over 1656 to become more centralised. The responsibilities of the major generals also increased, including their job to standardise not only weights and measures, but also time. As 1656 went on, without any sign of a repeat of Penruddock, the justification for the cost of these expensive militias began to wane, and so too were garrisons reduced. If the responsibility of the major generals had been restricted solely to earthly security, then this system might have gone down as a slightly unpopular response to a genuine threat, a quirk of government which relied so heavily on its military. But of course, the major generals were not charged solely with earthly security. In the minds of many Puritans, Cromwell chief amongst them, only with a reformation of manners would England reach its fated place as a nation of the elect. While there were justifications on security grounds to ban cockfights and other sports to prevent conspirators from conspiring, the sinful nature of these events was also part of the reason. Godliness was to be inculcated in the population, and temptations to sin banned or curtailed. To quote from the official instructions, the major generals were to, quote, "encourage and promote godliness and virtue, and discourage and discountenance all profaneness and ungodliness, and endeavour that the laws against drunkenness, blaspheming, taking the name of God in vain by swearing and cursing, plays and interludes, and profaning the Lord's day, be put in more effectual execution than they have been hitherto." End quote. But if the public were to be properly educated in godly manners, then their teachers had to be of the best quality. And so once again, the standards of churchmen and schoolmasters became a matter of national policy. In 1654, the newborn Protectorate had formed the Triers and Ejectors. The Triers were a national body designed to assess new churchmen for their education and quality, and had been fairly successful. The Ejectors operated on a county-by-county basis, with the job of investigating and ejecting both churchmen and schoolmasters who were unfit for the job. This could mean anything from having a substandard education, drinking their tithes away, or for not following the more Calvinist style of worship brought in by Parliament. They had largely been unsuccessful, just one of the many initiatives ordered by London which were ignored by localities. The arrival of the major generals revived the ejectors, but even with the powers bestowed to these new governors, the process of ejecting poor ministers was slow, tedious, and often unsuccessful. Often, those preachers judged to be unfit by the hotter sort of Protestant because they still pined for the old church and the Book of Common Prayer of Elizabeth and James's time, were quite popular with their congregations, who themselves favoured these traditional rites. Faced with continuing local resistance, the ejectors remained largely unsuccessful in their attempts to purify the churches of England. Only 120 ministers and schoolmasters were ejected during this period, mostly limited to jurisdictions with the most eager major generals. And none were more eager than Wolsey. Forget Cromwell. It was Major General Charles Wolsey who was the stereotypical Puritan. Paul Lay describes him showing a, quote, pathological adherence to the Protector's cause, as well as unhinged. In February 1656, he gleefully wrote to Thurlow and informed the secretary that he was cracking down hard on all pubs in his region, which were, quote, hostile to the government, those whose owner had other means of livelihood, such as were in big and dark corners, those of bad repute and disorderly, those suspected of being houses of ill fame, end quote. He met with the independent congregations in his jurisdiction and requested a list of all the people who needed correction. Within 3 months, Lancashire had been thoroughly corrected. Wolsey had closed more than 200 alehouses, and the county's prisons were full of the morally challenged. He also took a particularly vindictive delight in prosecuting married couples who had wed in a religious ceremony, since these had been banned in 1653. It was part of the reform package drafted by Matthew Hale, if you remember him, and it was one of the few reforms taken up and passed by Barebones' Parliament. Well, in Wolsey's patch, if you had married according to your community's tradition, you were a criminal and packed off to prison. Wolsey's reign of terror, or moral crusade, depending on how you view his efforts, came to an end in June 1656, when he died, at least partly from exhaustion. His admirers mourned his, quote, sincere, zealous, and upright endeavours, end quote. I have to imagine that more than one pint was raised in honour of his death in whatever pubs had survived him. Major General Barkstead was tasked with reforming the society in Middlesex and London, which was a huge ask, which he nevertheless approached enthusiastically. On one notable occasion, he arrested several, quote, loose wenches, end quote, and then had them transported to Jamaica. Another time, he and Colonel Thomas Pride ventured into a bear garden in Bankside as part of their ban on bear baiting, dogfights, and cockfights. They then killed all the bears, dogs, and cocks, firmly putting an end to the 3 sports in that arena, although I do feel for the animals. Couldn't they find a nice farm to send them to? Barkstead was quite productive. 3 times as many prosecutions for moral crimes came before the Middlesex JPs in 1655 than had in 1652. The most zealous major generals wrote often to Cromwell and Thurlow, describing in gleeful words how brilliant their reformation of manners was and how effectively they were turning England and Wales into a godly nation. Others, like Whaley and Desborough, were more realistic, but nevertheless saw their work as a net positive, which would still need time to firmly take root. Cromwell was publicly thrilled by their work. When he opened the Second Protectorate Parliament, more on that next time, he sung the Major General's praises. Historians are generally sceptical about the success of the reformation of manners, although Gentles does acknowledge that, quote, the decade of Puritan rule, the 1650s, was also the decade when the recorded rate of bastardy, meaning out-of-wedlock births, sank to its lowest point ever. Less bastardy suggests less fornication, which in turn suggests less drunkenness, end quote. But the relative failure of these campaigns is usually put down to the sheer scale of the other duties placed at the Major General's feet, collecting the decimation tax chief amongst them, which took up most of their time and resources, as well as the short length of their time in power, because, spoiler alert, the rule of the Major Generals, which Whiggish historians have long claimed branded a sort of cultural aversion to standing armies within English culture, lasted all of 10 months. By May 1656, the reality that the Protectorate was hemorrhaging money could no longer be ignored. The decimation tax had not brought in the sums expected, and so despite some modest cuts to the military budget, the regime still faced an annual deficit of more than £700,000. The Western design had not resulted in a windfall of Spanish gold flowing into the treasury, and instead landed the government with a new burden in Jamaica, which was expensive in both money and lives, as the English fought both the Jamaican people and the Jamaican climate. There was also a drop in trade, courtesy of the now official naval war with Spain since October 1655. So, Cromwell summoned the Major Generals to meet with his Council of State, and over the course of a month they debated what to do. Attendance at these meetings was mandatory. When one Major General, William Gough, requested to be excused to deal with a family emergency, he was denied. This was all hands on deck. Multiple options were considered. Raising the monthly assessment tax was one means, expanding the decimation tax by reducing the threshold required to qualify for paying it was another. But whichever path was chosen, the question of its legitimacy was a serious concern. The decimation tax had already been enacted by protectoral decree, and this was still the country which a decade and a half ago had collapsed into civil war, partly over the right of an executive to levy taxes without the consent of the legislature. However the money was to be raised, many around the table insisted that a parliament had to be called to justify it. There was also the small matter of the instrument of government mandating that Parliament meet after a declaration of war, and they were now at war with Spain. But Oliver Cromwell was resembling Charles I more and more, and just like his royal predecessor, he was less than enthusiastic about calling a new Parliament. Twice now he had been burned by them, first by the nominated Assembly, and then by the first Protectorate Parliament, and he wasn't sure that the third time would be the charm. But most of the Major Generals fully believed their own propaganda. Already highly enthusiastic supporters of the new system and their reforming agenda, they were largely insulated from the more critical reaction to their work. They mostly worked through their dozens of commissioners, who were often themselves firm believers in the cause, and either way less inclined to report negative reactions to their superiors. There were exceptions, like Desborough, but most of the Major Generals insisted to Cromwell that calling a new Parliament would not be a mistake. The country would surely elect MPs supportive of the Protectorate, and a new Parliament would settle the financial affairs of the state out of sheer gratitude for its work. Even better, if the decimation tax was approved by a Parliament, it was expected that much of the rancour which surrounded it would dissolve and make collecting it easier. Cromwell was initially not convinced. The meetings devolved, reducing in both size and formality as the month wore on and patience grew thin. Soon the meetings involved just an inner circle around Cromwell, including Lambert, Thurlow, Desborough and Fleetwood. Bitter words were exchanged, and the Protector's resistance to a new Parliament was worn down, at least partly due to his poor health. Ever since the news of the Western design, Cromwell had begun feeling his age with the wounding of his self-belief. He simply was not as self-assured as he'd once been. The Major Generals insisted that they could secure for their ruler a godly Parliament, and so, despite what he would say in hindsight was his better judgment, the Lord Protector gave his approval. Next time, we will see the election for the second Protectorate Parliament, where the Major Generals will discover just how unpopular their rule had become, as we invite back onto the stage the Commonwealth's men. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders, the Duke of Hanson, Harold Hanson, the Marquess of Queensberry, Brent Sitz, and the Earl of Pembroke, Amir Latifi. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can also access the ad-free feed through a membership there. Pax Britannica is part of the Airwave History Bundle. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.